Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway. I'm glad you joined me today. Our services begin this morning at Riverdale Community Church at 8:30, and our morning worship service in Garrison at the Garrison Church of God begins at 10:30. Remember, daylight savings time begins this Sunday, so that changes everything. Unfortunately, you lose an hour of sleep, and that's not so much fun. I want to talk to you a little bit about touched by God's grace today. We're going to be looking at Ephesians chapter 3, verses 8 through 15, and we'll also be looking at some thoughts from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 5 through 8. One of the most powerful things about this whole thing in Isaiah chapter 6 of Isaiah's vision is the imagery that God chooses to confront the young man Isaiah. He's probably around 16 at this time. He is confronted with some imagery that meant something directly to him, and we don't always think about that, but we need to remember a couple of things. The key event that kicks off this entire vision is Isaiah says, in the year that King Uzziah died. Uzziah is really key, or his death is key to this entire vision. What exactly happened with Uzziah? King Uzziah was a powerful, able king. He ruled for 51 to 52 years, and there's discrepancy there because of the way in which dating was done at various times in the Bible. So we don't know whether it was 51 or 52 years, but he reigned for a very long time. Isaiah had grown up under Uzziah's kingship. It had been a very wealthy and prosperous time for the nation of Judah. It had been a time when they had reached one of the high points of their national history. And now, as it was coming to a close, Isaiah is struggling with the rise of the Assyrians again and all of the troubles that were involved in that. It is also very likely that Isaiah was King Uzziah's grandson, maternal grandson. It was probably his mother was the daughter of King Uzziah. And his father was probably one of the priests, the Aaronic priests in the temple. So he had unique opportunities of access to the temple and to the palace. In addition to this, he seems to have struggled, as most of the Israelite people did, with what exactly happened to Uzziah. About 8 to 10 years before Uzziah's death, a terrible event happened in the life of Uzziah. Uzziah had grown powerful and prosperous as a king, and it says that he had grown proud. And as a result of that, he decided that he could offer incense on the incense altar in the holy place within the temple itself. That place was reserved only for the priests, and they entered twice a day to offer incense on the incense altar. Why Uzziah thought this would work has always puzzled me until recently. I was looking at some archaeological discoveries and discovered that there was another temple, Jewish temple, at this time, far to the south of Jerusalem, about 35 miles, and it was at a fortress location called Tel Arad. It was discovered in 1962, and some very interesting things were a part of that particular temple. The temple was built, or started being built, by King Solomon. He seems to have made the first sacred enclosure there, or what they call a cultic enclosure, that would eventually become the full-blown temple. About 100 years later, during the time probably of King Jehoram and his queen Athaliah, the temple was added to. A large sacrificial altar was built in the temple itself, which allowed animal sacrifice. And in addition to that, a most holy place was added on the side of the altar, and going back along the back of the altar, it was added to the holy place of the temple. So those two things were added. In the most holy place, 2 standing stones were placed. It is believed that originally these standing stones represented Yahweh and probably combined the worship of Yahweh with the worship of Baal, viewing Yahweh as a type of Baal, and adding to it a pillar or a stone column representing Asheroth, who was the consort goddess of Baal. And so in this sense, it added that level or that layer of worship. Outside of the most holy place was placed the incense altar. Evidently, this continued to be used up until the time of King Hezekiah, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the king could evidently enter in and offer incense within the holy place of this temple. And probably King Uzziah had done just exactly that on several occasions throughout his kingship. And so when he became more powerful and more able and more skilled, he could not understand why he, as the leader of the nation of Judah, could not enter the most holy place or enter the holy place and offer incense like he had probably done on several occasions at the temple at Arad. So what we understand is the arrogance that led to that. It is sometimes the arrogance that we get with being too familiar with spiritual things in our lives. We become too comfortable with God. We begin to believe that God is what we want him to be, and we begin to treat him unethically. And sometimes we mix things with our worship and with our understanding of God that have nothing to do with God, have nothing to do with his purpose, his will, or his plan. And somehow we believe that doesn't offend God. When Uzziah entered the temple and desired to offer incense, it says that 80 priests withstood him and tried to keep him from entering the holy place and offering incense. Uzziah became very angry and threatened these priests and basically told them he had a right to do so because he was king. At that moment, God strikes Uzziah with leprosy, and for the rest of his life, he will have to live in a house separated from his family, separated from the rest of the people of Judah, because his leprosy made him unclean and made him unclean to enter the temple, to enter his own palace, to enter any of the precincts of Jewish homes or even of his nobles' homes, because in simply entering them, he would have made them unclean. And so for the rest of his life, Uzziah lives by himself from his family, and his son Jotham actually rules the kingdom. Jotham has a son, Ahaz, who will become the king of Judah. And I'll be talking about him in just a moment. Isaiah's struggle when he is in the temple is that King Uzziah has died. And Isaiah is seeing there God in his glory and in his power. That rattles Isaiah. Up until this point, it seems like going around Judah, there were a lot of people that were saying, well, God was unfair in doing that to King Uzziah. I mean, his intent was good. His desire was good. His plan was good. He just got a little carried away. And why did God do that to him? That doesn't make any sense. Suddenly, Isaiah is in the very presence of God. And he is high and lifted up. And his presence and power is manifest. Around him fly the seraphim, who are burning like fire. And in front of him is the incense altar of heaven with burning coals, and the incense, the prayers of God's saints rising before him. And suddenly Isaiah is terrified. And he cries out, I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. And in other words, the intent of my heart is not good. And suddenly I understand why Uzziah was punished. He had basically presumed on the glory of God. Very often we presume on the glory of God. What Isaiah understood in that moment was that it was God's grace that had not struck Uzziah down dead. It had been grace in that moment. And sometimes God's grace doesn't always feel like grace. Sometimes when we have stepped over the boundaries, God's grace is that he does not give us a more serious punishment for our offenses. I am stunned by this whole concept. And Isaiah says, God, I have accused you, and the people I live among have accused you of things that are not fair. We are unclean in our thought, and I am now in this temple, and I deserve to be struck dead. I am now in your presence, and I deserve to be struck dead. But one of the seraphim goes and takes a coal off of the incense altar and brings it and touches Isaiah's lips with that coal and says, since this has touched your lips, you are clean. Wow. I think about the man Paul, or as he was called at that time, Saul. He had persecuted the church. He had persecuted Christ. He had gone after those things that were righteous. And having lived in Jerusalem, Paul was more than aware of the things that had happened in Jerusalem. We don't know if he was there at any of the time when Jesus was in Jerusalem, but we do know that he had certainly seen the work of the apostles and the disciples in that city following Pentecost. He had certainly understood what God was doing in and through this Christian movement. And so, breathing out threatenings and having a letter that gave him authority to capture Christians and imprison them, having placed them in prison where they died, he was feeling his strength and power. He was doing the will of God. He was going to persecute these Christians. And so he arrives outside of Damascus. On the road, he is suddenly struck blind and struck down. And standing before him is the risen Christ. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul at that moment recognizes the glory of God. He did not want the blindness. He didn't want the struggles. And Christ will say to Ananias, who comes to heal Paul, he will say to him, "This man will suffer great things for me." And Paul says to the Ephesians that Christ saved me. His grace saved me. In spite of all these difficulties and struggles I have gone through, and all those that I probably will go through in the future, God's grace has saved me. It has saved me because I really did not understand the glory of Christ. And when I did, it transformed me. King Ahaz would not be transformed. He would do some very evil things. He would set up incense altars throughout the land of Judah, where he would offer incense to other gods. He would carry away the heart of the people of Judah to idolatry. He would also force the priests to remove the bronze altar from before the most holy place in the temple at Jerusalem, and he would have it placed in a courtyard where he could burn his own incense on it, sort of sticking his fist in the face of God and saying, "There, so you did it to my grandfather, you're not going to do it to me." It depends on how we want to take the grace of God. In the book of Revelation, it talks about these 7 seals, and when the final seal is opened, it says that there's quietness in heaven, and the angels come carrying incense, the 7 angels from the presence carrying incense. And one of them takes coals off of the incense altar and pours incense into a censer and swings it and throws it into the earth, and it brings judgment to the earth. What is interesting, when we have faced the glory of God, when we have stood, as it were, before the incense altar, we will either accept the grace of God or we will accept the judgment of God. But we will accept one or the other. I want to accept his grace. I hope you do as well. God bless you. See you for service.